Hey, good evening, everybody. It's Leilani with The Magical Solution. Welcome back to my YouTube channel, to my Facebook page, to my TikTok, Instagram. Thank you guys for joining me on these sporadic book club nights, right? We try and do it once a week. Sometimes it's Tuesday, sometimes it's Wednesday, sometimes it's Thursday. Today it's Thursday. So we are going to continue moving forward with our book by author Andrew Jackson Davis. He was a medium and whom you would say the first spiritualist before spiritualism became a thing. And his books have laid the foundation for the spiritualist movement, which then branched off to the spiritist movement, which then we've seen come to the Americas and influence the cultures here in the diaspora, and we get the extensions and the beautiful tapestries of espiritismo. So, we can kind of trace back the lineage all the way to this guy here, among many others. I'm only scratching the surface among many others. So, for those of you who are joining me on TikTok, hello, hello, hello. Um, but if you're the type of people who really need to see the script and see the book that we are reading, I highly suggest you share this live before you head on over to my YouTube channel so that you can read along with me. All right, so let me get to it here. Here we go. Here we go. We are on chapter 6. And oh, up to this point, we've been talking about spirits after death and what happens to them, where do they go, and what does the afterworld or the afterlife look like according to this sort of, philosophy. Now, again, this is someone who claims, oh shit, what happened? Oh my God. This is someone who has claimed to be, oh no, hold on, let me make sure. 154, here we go. Who never really claimed to be anything spiritual, and he was just a dude, kind of like a precursor, kind of like an Edgar Casey of his time, right? He would have these dreams, he would have these visions, he would have these thoughts, he would just record, and the information he received was very much rooted in the sciences of the day, including, philosophies like Swedenborg and Mesmer and all that, but specifically the sciences of the day, right? Like we were seeing uh them understanding astronomy better, them understanding the atom better, them understanding a lot of things. The telegraph was coming out, telegram, the I mean, like, we had so much stuff going on. And so this young man, although his story claims that he was an uneducated, kind of illiterate sort of boy from Poughkeepsie, like little farmer kid, um we do see that he has an interest in these sort of paranormal investigations, these sort of paranormal sciences, these sort of interests in electricity, magnetism, et cetera, et cetera. And so you see it reflected in his writings. But I will say, up to this point, we have read some crazy stuff. I mean, he's talking about like interplanetary, interdimensional. This is like a time before quantums, a time before this discussion of unified field theory. Like before all of that, he was having these sort of visions, I guess, that really speak to what we're talking about today, which is why the New Age movement loves spiritualism, loves it. All right, so we are on chapter 6. Let's get to it. The title of the chapter. Why does this keep happening to me, you guys? Somebody come for your girl. There we go. There we go. Much better. Celestial rivers in space. Celestial rivers in space. Let me raise up my volume in case you can't hear me. So, from each of the Earth's in our own systems, great electrical and magnetic rivers flow out and in like ceaseless tides. That was the first sentence of chapters. From each of the Earths in our systems, great electrical and magnetic rivers flow out and in like a ceaseless tide. And on their soft golden bosom, all death emancipated men, women, and children float into their celestial home. By the same means, they and all other voyagers may and do return again and again. The flowing and ebbing of these elemental Gulf streams correspond in a general way to the forward and backward movements of the blood from its governmental center, which is the heart, to the outermost parts of the body, like the limbs and the fingertips. As the crimson fluid of the heart pulsates throughout the arteries and veins of the human body, so the magnetic and electric streams uh, of the upper regions start from geocenters and heliocenters flowing through the heavenly fields. Okay, so this supports his earlier chapters when he discusses sort of the cosmology of the multiverse. And he explains how the sun being the center of the galaxies and how there's many of them, from that sun emanates the unified field and or the unified field of that particular galaxy, right? There's only so much that gravity can hold in, right? But we see that within that sphere there are electromagnetic waves pulsing in and out, emanating from that sun source. That's what he's saying. Now that is both literal, as we know through astronomy, but it's also spiritual because he talks about this as being the cosmology of our progression and evolution as spirits. We start from the outermost planetary sphere and we work our way in towards the central sun, where we then reunify with quote unquote spirit or the unified field or God or whatever you want to call it, right? So that's essentially what he's talking about. Again, he's simply reiterating that again. So the directions of these streams are as various as the radial lines from a globe. These living currents promote the refinement and assimilation of atoms among the organs, that is to say, globes of the infinite body of God. They form and flow forth between all the solar centers and inhabited globes of space, whence they stream onward and inward into the next great sphere of human existence, which we call the Summerland. So, this is where spiritualism and spiritism tend to deviate, right? So, in spiritualism, there is ultimately this sort of end goal of heaven, this final destination, and they call it the Summerland. Whereas in Spiritism, it is a cycle of reincarnation for spiritual refinement of the spirit, which is, according to this, is the same thing. Don't get me wrong, it's the same thing. But not all spiritists agree on the end result. Not all of them want to be the end result of unification with God or just the deconstruction of our entire whatever. Some prefer that there'd be even further levels and further sort of deifications that they could move through. Others will believe in like a final resting place, kind of like a heaven. Others see sort of the abyss and the darkness where they finally just get to rest altogether, like they literally don't have to think about it anymore, like it's just nothingness. So again, this is where, the beauty of the philosophy and when it starts to come up with a corpus, and starts moving towards the religious aspect. This is where we get to see the diversity, and it's a beautiful, beautiful thing, right? So, the earth on which we live is a revolving electrical machine, an immense magnetic battery. With a swiftness beyond imagination, the Earth's electricity streams in great ribbons and winds itself upon its own natural spool at the north, where it is transformed into a more refined motive force, an ethereum, or a celestial magnetism, if you will. This is positive and warm to the negative and cold volumes of electricity. Its warm stream, rising high in the air and flowing above the South Pole, pulsates onward and upward, outward and inward, until it breaks like a note of immortal melody on the shores of the summerland. There are also electrical rivers setting toward Earth and the various planets in our solar systems from different regions of the spirit land. They convey constant pulsations to life of mankind from the great central sun of intelligence in the second sphere. Yet, it is an error to suppose that all personal communications between the populations of Earth and the higher spheres is possible only through the aerial rivers. Pause. Let's talk about that shit. Let's talk about that shit because this concept that he's talking about here, this electromagnetic sort of ebb and flow that he's talking about here. So the magnetic flow is the flow from the earth to the central sun, like from the outermost depths of the radiation back to the center, and the electrical current is coming from the central sun back out to us. Both of these currents that are moving in waves carry information, is what is being said here. So the magnetic stuff is carrying information about the progression of spirit, and will carry in those currents dead spirits as well who are on the path of progression, while the electrical current being sent out to the rest of the universe is informed with how to live humanely and how to actually be and pursue and move in progression. They are little hints, they are little electrical vibrations that we receive through our nervous system, through our hair, through our skin, through our aura, that help guide us toward progression. And essentially, this is profound because, again, we don't start seeing this type of conversation until we get to more of the metaphysical practices of spiritism in the Caribbean, where we really see a central focus on healing, right? Like prior to this, spiritism had its sort of, you know, had its sort of piece about healing that I can get into later, but it wasn't the central focus of spiritualism and spiritism. Central focus of spiritualism and spiritism was communicating with the dead, period, point blank. Whether they were using that for healing or for other reasons, usually it was to get information from the spirits to, again, get their help, assistance in progression, so that we can inform them what we're doing and they have advice and blah 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 blah. The focus on healing came in when we started seeing the movement in the Caribbean and South America, where healers really thrived. We had indigenous native folk healers, curanderas, men and women who knew herbs, men and women who knew how to set bones, men and women who knew everything, right? And so when this information gets to them, this is where we see spiritism and espiritismo morph into something different. Um, and one of the pieces of language that we very much talk about, or that you see sort of bridge that gap, is this language of spiritual currents, right? And so this is stuff that I teach in my spiritual development classes, which is why I'm not going to get into it now. But essentially, this is sort of a precursor of that. They are talking about these currents on a much more cosmic, larger scale, but they also exist within us too. Again, whole other conversation. If you want to learn more about that, you have about a week left to sign up for my class, right? So let's get to it. Yet, it is an error to suppose that all personal communication between the populations of Earth and the higher spheres is possible only through the aerial rivers. Okay? There is no space in the fields of infinitude which cannot be crossed by beings endowed with will. Another piece of support regarding proximity and spirits, right? Part of this whole metamodern movement of talking about espiritismo from a digital space is acknowledging that the ones who came before us are showing us their sciences, showing us their experiences, and all of them can show with almost certainty this line right here. There is no space in the fields of infinitude which cannot be crossed by beings endowed with will. Essentially, if you can think it, you can be there. If there's a spirit you want to communicate, all you literally have to do is think of them, and they could essentially be present, or you can essentially have a link to them, which now opens the door for communication, and it happens instantaneously regardless of proximity. That is something that is beautiful to see in a book that's written in the 1800s. Okay, beautiful. There is no space. Okay, sorry. I can't help but to want to read it again. Sorry. The celestial streams can be forded, and the very rivers of paradise made subservient to the eternal unrest of the mind. But the orderly method of traveling between the earths and the interior universe is by means of the rivers described. Wow. Wow, that's beautifully written. That's beautifully written. Because he's acknowledging here that these celestial streams do exist within us and can easily be contaminated by our own mind and our own unrest, which can essentially block our abilities to communicate with spirit. And so the best way to sort of bypass that is to address them as external currents, electric and magnetic currents that can be manipulated and worked in the physical material world, um, until until our currents have been purified, and our purification comes in through the mastery of the mind, emotions, and actions, right? Therefore, we wouldn't contaminate our currents, basically. They are the recognized celestial highways connecting spheres and globes. Oh wow, that was a short that was a short chapter. All right, now we're on chapter 7. So, the constitution and location of the Summerland, that is the title of chapter 7. The order of the universe is as perfect as its varieties are innumerable. The principles engaged in forming worlds are incessantly decomposing them. In no other way can perpetual youth be bestowed upon the finer bodies in space. Atoms sufficiently refined to ascend above the mineral compound enter into forms of vegetable life. Vegetation delegates its finest atoms to build up the animal kingdom. The most refined animal atoms enter into the support of human bodies. The most refined particles of human bodies, which are not required to construct and support the garment of immortality, ascends to form the solids, fluids, and ethers of the engulfant. I'm sorry, the effulgent. What is that word? I don't even know that word. The effulgent zone. Hmm. to which all human beings are hastening. Okay? So he's just reiterating previous chapters where he talked about the lower levels of life, if you will, and that progression. So he talks about, the mineral kingdom, the vegetable kingdom, the animal kingdom, and he talks about the different, all working all the way up to man, as we've spoken about before. He sees this is a very human centered kind of spirituality where man is sort of like the peak of, like, you know, nature. And so through that information, he's simply reiterating here that it's not just about progressing through these bodies of life, but refining oneself in order to progress through these strands of life. Like, it's not just minerals then moving into vegetables and then vegetables moving into animal. It's not just that. It's the finest minerals, the most refined minerals that break past the natural laws of the mineral kingdom. Those are the ones that get that evolution into the vegetable kingdom. The finest, most refined atoms of the vegetable kingdom, that bypass the natural order of the vegetable kingdom, those are the ones who get elevated into the animal kingdom, etc., etc. And this is essentially to progress and move the system forward, right? That is not to say that in physical 3D world, the reality is mineral, vegetable, animal. There's no moralistic refinement of anything happening. It's just a natural thing that happens in the natural world, right? And so this is really very much about putting philosophizing and putting moralistic views on evolution, right? And this whole the science of the times. This is what we're doing here. Um, so you could take this or leave this, but that's essentially how he kind of makes up the cosmology. There is thus, let's see, there is thus established and maintained an eternal youth in the spiritual universe. The spiritual spheres have been termed recently summer lands, and counting man's earthly existence as the first world of spirit life, there are in all 6 spheres in the ascending flight toward deity, which fills the 7th sphere. The central positive power repels the physical and attracts the spiritual concurrently. Ooh, say that again. The central positive power, that central sun that exists within the 7th sphere, right? Because we're talking about the furthest parts of our galaxy. And at the time, there were 7 planets, not 9, right? So, like, out of the 7th sphere, the furthest one all the way to deity, to God, in the innermost 7th sphere, that is such a positive power that it repels the physical and attracts and pulls in spiritual by its nature. So essentially, you have no choice as a spiritual being. You have no choice because you are embodied with spirit. You have no choice but to move back towards the center. Your progression in in this life is inevitable. You can even actively try and sabotage yourself. You can actively try and not do what you're supposed to do. We see it all the time, but you still end up where you're supposed to end up. And at the end of the day, you're only sort of delaying the inevitable. And by delaying the inevitable without going with the flow, right? You suffer. That's where the thought of suffering comes in. It's this idea of controlling. It's the idea of not going with the flow, not surrendering, not trusting in the current, right? And so when you don't do that and you actively try to go against it, you inflict your own suffering. That's essentially what they're saying here in this piece. Crazy. Okay. So the circulation of matter is therefore outward from the center, while spirit travels toward the center from without. These two reciprocal currents flow incessantly, right? That electric magnetic back and forth that we were talking about, that's what he's talking about now, but on a spiritual level, right? Inconceivable oceans of world building materials expand from the fountain at the center, while innumerable multitudes of individualized spiritual and angelic men, women, and children from all human bearing planets in space are marching toward the positive, attractive center and approaching nearer and nearer the eternal sun sphere of the Father and the Mother. So, if if we didn't have a doubt before, or if there was a doubt before how Andrew Jackson Davis views spirit and views the sort of deity at the center that we are all moving towards, he views them as the co-creative force of mother and father, a male and female center. Okay? A yin and yang, if you will, at the center of our universe, right? Stop playing. See, but here's the thing. Here's the thing. The reason why this is so profound, as I had mentioned before, we're talking about someone who claimed to have been pretty much illiterate, someone who was not very well educated, was interested in educated things, would go to like local discussions, would go and watch these scientists and these lecturers come in when they came into town. So he was interested in all that, but his ability to communicate that, his ability to study that on his own was very limited, right? So that's part of why this is so profound. But another reason why this is so profound is that we're seeing the enlightenment and the awakening up towards these sort of Eastern philosophies, believe it or not, these sort of Eastern philosophies, because let's be for real, I love me some North American, some Turtle Island, stuff, but like when we're looking at what is being here versus what has already been, um they're all happening at the same time. Like we are seeing an awakening sort of everywhere of people sort of coming up to things that our ancient ancestors already knew, right? The innate dualism within God, the unified field that surpasses that dualism, the expressions of these energies in nature, and the reflection of science and nature's laws and divine laws and how they interplay with each, all of that, freaking Middle East, Far East Asia, India, Africa, these places knew this already. This gnosis was old knowledge. This was like yesterday's homework. And so for this to come in at this time is a beautiful thing to see. It's a reemergence despite them thinking it's an original idea. Let's be real, everyone who writes a book think that they have an original idea. There's no such thing as original ideas, but essentially it's beautiful to see that this information finally makes it everywhere. And it got us to like the 1800s over here on this side, but at least we got it. And that's what's important, right? So the formation of the different summerlands can be seen in those principles which evolve the suns and stars of the firmament. It is the teaching of science that world constructing forces are latent in the mass, and that the formation of a dewdrop is not less wonderful than that of an inhabited world. So also the formation of spiritualized material belts is as natural and rational as that of the primordial rings out of which all planets, satellites, and lesser bodies are developed subsequently. So what he's talking about here, um, is that the formation of the Summerland, right? Like the way that it is evolved from these principles is essentially similar to that of a like Saturn's rings. It's a current. It's a current. So it kind of looks like a celestial belt. But think about it in terms of as a spiritual belt, not a celestial belt. But that, I mean, if you could compare it to anything, that's what it would look like. And so therefore, when you see planets like Uranus, planets like Saturn, where they have rings around it, and every planet will have rings around it. It's just of a lesser or more dense band, right? So like and that ring comes from past, impacts. It comes from stuff that's radiating out from the planet. It comes from stuff that's leaking out from its gravitational pull, things. There's so many reasons to have these little sort of cloud dusts outside of a planet sphere, but essentially that cloud dust in is the best way that they can describe how these heavens, these summer lands, these otherworldly places, how they get formed. Okay. So hopefully that made sense. But a question arises whether the spiritual zones will not be themselves broken up and distributed through space by counter attractions. I answer here that they cannot be drawn asunder by any superior external force, for they are constituted of ultimate particles, having only remote affinities for the constituents of other bodies in space. Another question is why the summer land is not round like a globe rather than a vast zone or stratified belt. And I answer that according to astronomical science and the primary figure was spheroidal. The oval is consequently the first form of matter, its genesis and also its exodus. So, also in music, the eighth and the first note are essentially the same. The last sound is a perfect reiteration or reproduction of the first sound and becomes the basis of another and higher in scale, onward and upward, progressively. This harmonial law of continuous reproduction will answer the question concerning the zone shape of the summerland. According to this law, a broad, here's that word again, effulgent, rotating belt or zone is the first form of world building in the stellar universe. So, also, it is the highest and final form which matter is capable of assuming in its most exalted condition of ethereal and essential refinement. Lastly, the physical universe is itself spheroidal in shape, composed of a progressive series of successfully ascending circles of suns and planets, and it is nothing but the material garment, the organized body of the interior spiritual universe, which was not made with hands, but is eternal in the heavens. I hope y'all got that. So yeah, so essentially, again, Andrew Jackson Davis is essentially comparing the current science, the current astronomy, and the current understanding of not only the sky, but mathematics, music, etc. And that understanding is that there is a perpetual progression, a spiraling upwards, and that perpetual progression occurs at the transition from the first to the last, from omega to alpha and from alpha back to omega, etc., etc. That phase is where we see this occurring, where the evolution occurs, right? And so that makes sense to him as to why our summerland would look like that, and the summerland being the central sun of each progressive life, of each incarnation. So if you, and remember, we talked about in the last couple of chapters that you don't just go from one level to the next. There's like 3 or 4 levels within each level that you're going through before you then elevate out and go into the next level. And that elevation out is essentially returning to the central sun of that particular level. So it's going in order to go up and out. Hopefully that made sense. Woo! Okay. Yeah. Okay. So as regards to the location of the second sphere, right? So we was just talking about the summerland of the first sphere, right? So as regards to this to the location of the second sphere, it is girdled by the first sphere, or more categorically, by the Milky Way, just as its rings girdle the planet Saturn. The analogy is perfect. In appearance, it is like a beautiful morning. The surface is diversified endlessly with valleys, rivers, hills, mountains, innumerable parks, the trees and shrubbery of which resemble, however, nothing on earth. They are more like the vegetation of Saturn. An incalculable variety of flowers lends a peculiar prismatic charm to the far extending territories, and the divinely soft ether surpasses all conception. To be there is to be in the presence of holiness, where every tree speaks to the heart and every flower pronounces a benediction. Were the size of our earth multiplied 7 million times, it would give the extent of a single park in the second sphere. The latter, once more, is a magnificent belt bespangled with countless jewels, and it is part of the divine vesture of him whose praise is celebrated best in the eloquence of sacred silence. Oh my God, dude, you are a poet. What the flying F? You are a poet, bro. Woo! So I kind of want to go back a little bit to the footnotes because um, where are we? Constitute location of the Summerland. Oh, that was the previous chapter. Yeah. And that's going to go back a little bit more. Okay. So it says here that the theory concerning these celestial rivers is put somewhat differently in one of the earlier works and should be taken in connection with the text as it stands above. As there is vital circulation in the human body, so there is circulation of living forces between the spiritual world and the several planets. The south pole of the earth sends forth a magnetic stream. The tide passes through the orbits of Venus and Mercury very near the surface of the sun, whence it surges silently but swiftly on till it reaches the spirit land. From from another section of the spirit land there starts a lighter fluid, which is also a tidal river, toward the north pole of the earth, and this is unchangeably electrical. It is a positive stream which flows from us to the spiritual world, and a negative one from the latter to our own planet. I have observed very often the spirits of our human friends, when at death they pass out of the corporal body, ascend to a height of some 7 miles, where they meet with celestial rivers, and are transported thereby to their spirit home. As there are thus streams of communication between our globe and this bourne of souls, are there others which connect the latter with every world belonging to our planetary system. Okay, so essentially, just we're talking about the we're talking about the spider webs of communication, right? The same way in which airplanes all have their own path, the same way in which we have Bluetooth and Wi-Fi, the same way in which we used to be able to connect on phone lines and cable wires. So too, when we pass, when our body moves into spirit, there are currents, there are streams of communication that we can jump on or become a part of to then move to the next levels, right? Okay, let's get to the next one. Let me see. Okay. So, this is stated by Davis to be the result of most careful examinations of the physical structure of the Summerland, its fertile soils, lovely groves, vines, and flowers. But it is added that the world rearing principles are attracted from human emanations in all the planets. Right. There is no question that this presents a better synopsis of the subject than we have seen presented otherwise, suspecting that the formation of so called spiritual spheres by means of emanations from the various planets, it is the latter, however, which appeals more especially to Davis, who recurs to it on several occasions, and notably in his book The Present Age and the Inner Life, where he affirms presumably on his own authority, that 800 million tons of invisible emanations are given off by the Earth annually, not to speak of other planets belonging to the solar system. As he is not able to suggest what becomes of them otherwise, he assumes that they go to form the summerland of his visions, a material basis for which was necessary to his system. The scientific aspect of this notion, with its seeming suspension of the law of gravitation, is naturally not worth discussing. I have to remind everyone, by the way, that the person who put this book together and does these footnotes is such a bitter motherfucker. Like, they are so bitter. And he is forever talking shit about Davis as he's writing his notes. It's so funny. But I get it. You kind of have to be when you're going through these things. You do have to put your own footnotes. You have to put your own questions, your own, oppositional thoughts to make sure that when people go through this, that they're thinking about these things. Absolutely. Okay, so this other footnote says, now, if it were possible, in the case of a writer who not only admits that all of his records are the result of impressions received, but regards this method as the only way of truth and illumination, to interpret statements according to the values of their literal meaning, it would follow herefrom that the spiritual universe, being eternal in the heavens, anteceded the manifest universe, which is a product of time as to present form and mode, whether or not its elements may have pre-existed. It would follow also that the spiritual spheres are not composed of emanations from planets or suns now existing, which involves the grotesque idea that they are expanding continuously owing to accretions from without. But there is no need to accentuate this point, and it is stated only to show once more, but now after a different manner, that Andrew Jackson Davis, as a seer who saw visions of another world and of the life beyond, therein is to be distinguished from Andrew Jackson Davis, who, owing to impressions of others of another order and to his reflections thereupon, attempted to unfold a system of the universe. The findings of his seership will be of permanent interest to those who believe that such experiences is a general possibility, which in his case may have become actual. So essentially what he's saying is, like, we gotta look at Andrew Jackson Davis a little skeptically, because he admits that his visions are influenced by the thinkers and free movement thinkers of the time. He admits that he goes to these lectures, that he learns these things, that he was inspired by Swedenborg, inspired by Mesmer, inspired by all of these other, previous thinkers and scientists. And so there has to be some predation. There has to be some, I'm sorry, not predation. I'm sorry, trepidation with regards to going through his stuff and taking it as pure prophecy. On the other hand, I will have to disagree with that, because I teach my students that when they are communicating with spirits, when they are trying to receive visions, when they are in a space of deep contemplation and meditation, where do you think those conversations come from? How do you expect to understand parables and things like that if you yourself are not well read, or haven't, you know what I mean? Like, and that's not to say that we're talking about ableism, or we're talking about, this elite sort of intellectualism that tends to float around in the spiritual communities, but more of a sense of having a spiritual language, having a spiritual vocabulary, right? Even the most illiterate people of the past were given prayers, stories to tell. They were given oral traditions that kept their spiritual languages alive, even if it wasn't written or read out loud. That's the difference. And so in my opinion, Andrew Jackson Davis did nothing wrong. Instead, he educated himself and put himself in places of intellectuals, where he was able to feed his mind the right language, so that when these spirits spoke to him, they could speak in these terms and he'd be able to intelligibly communicate that in writing. And that makes a huge difference. That really, really does. I'm on. Okay, so this is the next chapter. We are not going to read this. So now we are going to open up the forum to questions. That is the next step. Are there any questions regarding what we just read, regarding Andrew Jackson Davis, regarding spiritualism, spiritism, espiritismo, regarding mediumship and what happens after we die, regarding spirits, any of that stuff? The floor is now open. Okay, beautiful. So if there are no questions, I want to give you guys a big thank you for hanging out with me for the book club tonight. Make sure that you comment, like, share, subscribe to show your support. Make sure you head over to my website and sign up to my newsletter to show your support. Make sure you share with people that I have classes running and that the deadlines for these classes are coming up really soon. And if you want people to get in on this information, if you want people who you feel would benefit from this, share, let them know, okay? You can always reach me on my website, www.themagicalsolution.com. And again, my name is Leilani. This is The Magical Solution. And this is how we grow. And I will see you guys next week for another chapter or two of the Harmonial Philosophy by Andrew Jackson Davis. Have a beautiful night.